you for my technical issue last week. Thank you for rejoining us today. So just to say again, I'm a marine scientist at the Haskins Shellfish Research Laboratory, which is located in the southern part of the state in Cumberland County. It has a long history of serving the oyster fishery of the Delaware Bay and various shellfish fisheries throughout the state. So world recognized laboratory in the southern part of the state. So it's really a pleasure to work there. I'm also affiliated with Sea Grant, New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium, as their aquaculture program coordinator. Okay, so just as an outline for today's talk, I'd like to highlight a high-level look at aquaculture around the world and here in the US. Focus in on aquaculture species that are grown here in New Jersey. Talk about the challenges around that industry, and then highlight the research and extension programs that we're doing at Rutgers University to support the industry and keep it vibrant and sustainable. The work I'll be presenting is not necessarily my own research. I'm involved in most of the projects, but I'm really here sharing work that's done through the collaborative team at the Haskins Lab. So just to put that up front, and keeping in with the lunch perspective here, it's really a smorgasbord of research. So I'm going to touch on a whole bunch of different types of projects that are going on to share the breadth of this research and sort of where we're going in the future. Okay, so thinking about aquaculture at a global perspective, we see this chart which shows fisheries, wild fish capture fisheries in the orangey yellow color, and then aquaculture shown in the blue. And we can see that wild capture fisheries are pretty much static in terms of production, while aquaculture is continually rising in the last years. So we anticipate a continuation of growth in global aquaculture production. In 2020, it was about 254 billion pounds, valued at about $263 billion produced globally. And of course, as human population rises, wild fisheries are likely not going to be able to keep pace with that. So there's a role for aquaculture to diversify protein production and meet the growing global demands for seafood. Okay, here in the US, these statistics are from NOAA for 2018. And the US actually ranks about 17th in terms of aquaculture production around the world. And only about 21% of the US seafood produced is from cultured species. The leading 5 types of aquacultured species are oysters, clams, mussels, salmon, and shrimp, with oysters being the big leader there with $219 million in production value. And most of the coastal states have some level of marine aquaculture. So we see that production spread throughout the country. Okay, here in New Jersey, aquaculture centers on 2 species, the hard clam, Mercenaria mercenaria, and the eastern oyster, Crassostrea virginica. Okay, the hard clam aquaculture industry in New Jersey has been around a while. It was started in the late 1970s. Production of clams in 2019 was about 6.5 million clams. And there are probably about 30, somewhere above 30 clam farmers in the state at this time. For oyster aquaculture, that's a relatively newcomer. Started in the late 1990s, and there are also about 30 farms in New Jersey, located in 4 different counties. We don't have really great production numbers, but in 2019, I think it was probably close to about 5.3 million oysters that were produced in the state by these 30 farms. Okay, just a glimpse. This is a partial listing of shellfish growers in the state. And just, I wanted to give you a highlight of the distribution of farms along the Atlantic coast of the state, touching most of the coastal bays on the Atlantic side of the state, and then up into the Delaware Bay with farms in both the southern portion of the bay in Cape May County, and then in the more moderate salinity portion of the bay up in Cumberland County. Okay, regardless of which species we're working with, production begins in a hatchery. The picture that you see at the top right is the Rutgers University hatchery, the Aquaculture Innovation Center. It's located not far from the Cape May Lewis Ferry in Cape May. So in the hatchery, adult clams or oysters are spawned, and the eggs are allowed to fertilize and developed into larvae, held in very large rearing tanks where they're fed artificial algal culture in very controlled conditions in terms of temperature and water filtration and quantity and quality of the food that they're fed. Ultimately, the larvae will settle into and metamorphose into the tiny little shelled animals that are very familiar to the animal that you'll find on your plate, just much, much smaller. So those tiny grains of sand there that look like tiny grains of sand are actually very young oysters in the early hatchery phase. So these young babies will then go to a nursery phase, which typically occurs on land, in either raceway tanks or upweller tanks where they're fed raw water and nursed to a little bit larger size, which can then be planted directly on the farms. In the case of hard clams, which of course are benthic organisms that burrow down into the sand and sediments, the clams are sort of sprinkled on the bay bottom and covered with nets. And the nets are, of course, put down to protect from predators. So that's typically how they're grown in the field. This particular site, we're looking at screens at an extreme low tide, and the farmer is sweeping the screens of macroalgae, trying to keep them clean so that there's plenty of water flow through to the clams. In the case of oysters, they're typically contained in some type of cage, basket, bag. They'll be planted at sizes anywhere from 2 millimeters to ideally more like 4 to 10 millimeters in size. They'll head out to the farm. The site that you see in the background here is an intertidal location in the lower Delaware Bay. So at low tide, we see extensive sand flats are exposed to the air. And this is ideal for a type of oyster culture called rack and bag culture. If you've seen pictures of cultivation in France or even Ireland, it's a common form of production there. So the farmers can actually walk off the beach at this location. The animals, the young oysters, are placed in these fine mesh bags and cultured throughout the production season. So as the oysters grow, their densities are split and they're placed in the next larger size mesh bag until they're grown to market size, which can take anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Here's just another size of an oyster bag at this rack and bag cultivation site. You can see the slightly larger oysters there in that bag. And here's a little farmscape of some workers on a farm sorting oysters for market size. The farm work is very intensive. There's plenty of cleaning to keep the bags clean, remove the fouling. And there's this constant task of splitting the stock as the oysters grow, so you have the optimal density of animals in any particular bag. You want them in the largest mesh size bag that will retain them, so there's optimal water flow. And then market sorting. Not every oyster in every bag is going to grow at the same rate. So there's this constant work through of the oyster bags to pull out market size oysters and kind of size sort, putting slower growers with slower growers, and fast growers are going to go off to market. Okay. So oyster farms are much more varied in grow out method, and it's really dependent on the site and the location. So in very deep water sites like the upper Delaware Bay, there's very large scale equipment, bottom cages that would contain smaller containers inside that would house the oysters. This particular picture on the left is Atlantic Cape's Fisheries Farm for Cape May Salt Farm up in the Upper Bay. The middle picture shows some floating cages located at Rose Cove and Barnegat Bay area. And then again in Barnegat, some bottom cages in a relatively shallow area, not as shallow as the intertidal site on the Delaware Bay, but still the farmers are able to get out there at low tide, handle the cages, pull up the cages, sort through the oysters. So you may have seen these types of farms as you're out enjoying or recreating on and around the bay. There's been a lot of growth in terms of oyster farm development in the Atlantic coastal bays. And again, each site, each farmer will adapt their own methodology, the type of gear they like to handle, the type of gear that's suitable for their site. Okay, so if we think about challenges, right, we've had this industry for a relatively long time, and we still only have maybe 60 farms in the state. So, what's holding it back? There are a lot of different challenges, including pathogens and predators. There are oyster diseases that, decimated the wild populations of oysters along the Atlantic coast of the US. Back in the 50s and again in the 80s. These pathogens are still present in our waters. So we need to manage and develop farms that can properly grow oysters and be profitable in the face of disease. We have changing climate that's impacting the temperature, the salinity regimes of our water, relatively undeveloped techniques. It's a young industry, so farmers are still perfecting methods, and researchers are still helping them perfect those methods. Everything relies on the hatchery. So if a hatchery fails, you may not get the seed that you need to grow. There's a lack of diversification in the industry with only focused on 2 main species. Winter loss, including, very harsh winters can result in oyster mortalities. We have a lot of user conflicts for space, including wildlife and sensitive wildlife that might be protected in species, as well as other users, people who want to be able to kayak or recreational fish or commercial fish in those same waters where oyster farms or clam farms might occur. Permitting is often a challenge for individuals. We need a skilled and willing workforce, constantly working toward that. And then we need consumer awareness. We need, consumers to understand how the oyster farms and clam farms operate, the high quality nature of the product, and understand what's happening on those farms to have some social license so we can continue to use public waters for these farms to grow great products and be vital and sustainable. Okay, so as a researcher, as an extension agent, these are all challenges that we work directly with our aquaculture industry or aquaculture sector to help them overcome these challenges and, do what they do even better than they're doing it presently. Okay, so I'm going to highlight some of the, large portfolio of projects, the type of work that we're doing at the Haskins Lab to promote aquaculture. Okay, one of the most important areas is selective breeding for performance traits. So if we hadn't developed over, the last 4 or 5 decades, oysters that were disease tolerant or resistant to disease, it would be impossible for this industry to emerge in the face of endemic diseases, because it just would cost too much to overcome the high losses that can occur in the face of disease. You just have to invest too much labor to grow the animals. So there really wouldn't be a benefit there in terms of profit. So early on, Rutgers University was one of the leading research institutions to develop these disease-resistant oysters. And this is just basically done through standard selective breeding techniques. Took survivors of disease outbreaks, produce progeny from those survivors, put them back out, expose them to the disease, again, take the survivors and use those survivors for the next generation. So through many, many years, we have developed a very robust parent stock that is able to survive in the face of disease. The middle graph here just shows some more recent work in 2016, where you can see those lines are comparing 5 or 6 different selectively bred stocks. That's a mortality graph, so you can see several of the stocks really perform better than others. In the top bars, you can see the intensity and prevalence of dermo disease and MSX disease at a test site in New Jersey. So where you see the very, very dark bars, those are stocks that didn't perform very well against the disease. And then you can see other bars that have more light intensity infections, and those stocks perform better. They're probably going to be the stocks that we want to use at this particular location. In terms of selective breeding, we're looking for traits like high performance, fast growth, and enhanced survival in high salinity sites. We're looking at shell color. We're looking at overwintering survival. Can we develop a hardier oyster that will better tolerate variable winter temperatures and extreme winter temperatures? So these are ongoing projects. Dr. Shming Guo is a geneticist at our laboratory. He leads all these projects. Again, he is like world-class researcher. He's done work all around the world and continues to lead this work. And we're really fortunate to have him in our state doing this work. Okay. So as a follow-on to selective breeding, we also want to try and diversify the types of animals that are grown through aquaculture in our state. So we're looking at working with the eastern oyster to develop high salinity stocks for our coastal bays. We're looking at the bay scallop, which is native to New Jersey, but populations have been in decline. And we're looking at the Atlantic surf clam, which is grows offshore in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's harvested. Surf clams are typically the type of clams that you'll find if you buy clam strips. They're made from surf clams or even canned clams. So the idea here is to develop a surf clam for aquaculture that can be grown both in those coastal area, offshore areas off our coast, but also in the coastal bays. So if we want to do that, we need to have a surf clam that's more heat tolerant. So we're working on establishing a line of surf clams that are able to adapt and grow and perform well at higher temperatures. So this not only is responsive to perhaps diversifying the portfolio of a clam farm or eastern oyster farm in our coastal bays, but may also be used for the fishery to add to their portfolio as we see migrational shifts in wild surf clam populations moving off our coast and further north. Maybe this fishery can be developing means to grow surf clams in an aquaculture setting. And we now have projects ongoing where we're working with that fishery sector to do some pilot work with offshore surf clam aqua farming. In terms of bay scallops, we're really looking to develop a bay scallop stock that can get to market in a single year. So this reduces the risks and losses associated with bay scallops through a longer time, and provides a really nice short-term crop to enhance a farm. Again, this work is being led by Dr. Shiming Guo. Dr. Daphne Monroe is leading the charge on the surf clam work off the coast right now. And again, it's very collaborative. We have a team of researchers that contribute to this work. Okay.
Hey, Lisa?
Yes.
There's a question in the chat about whether you guys work with Stockton and their projects.
We do have some overlap with Stockton University. Yes, we try and collaborate. I think I'll highlight one project at the end where we're working with Stockton folks.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, sure. So this is, so now that we're focusing on like developing surf clams that would be right for aquaculture setting, is it a good candidate species for our waters? We're looking at market and shelf life studies, but we're also looking at perfecting the growing methods. What are the nursery phase handling methods we can use to optimize survival and improve ultimately how many animals get to market. So there was a lot of work done in the early hatchery phase back in the 80s. And then there was a time where nobody really focused on surf clams. So a lot of this work that we did was again led by Dr. Monroe and Dr. Guo, but also was part of the graduate work of Mike Aquafreda. And he did a really great job looking at different rearing temperatures, different types of rearing methods, and looking between locations at what's successful. So, he kind of really optimized grow out methods. And we're also doing this with grow out. We're working directly with farms to try growing surf clams at different locations. And then we're looking at the success there. What were the sediment characteristics of the sites where it was successful? How did survival compare between sites? What was the water quality like in the sites? And what type of gear was best for growing those animals? And finally, in respect to market, we've done surveys with restaurants and chefs to understand how they might use the product, what their interest level was, what might be price points, and also look at shelf life. How do we best store these clams? If you look at these clams, I don't know if you're familiar with surf clams, but they're very active. They could basically crawl off your plate if they wanted to. And they have quite a bit of, like the shells gape quite a bit. So we wanted to understand, should they be stored on ice and drained? Should they be stored under damp towels? So we did that type of work to kind of set the pace for how they might be handled and how long the restaurants might have before they were no longer fresh enough to serve. Okay, this is just as a summary of Mike's work and the work of this project. There's a grower's guide for surf clam culture. If anyone's interested in that, I'd be happy to send that along, share it with Caitlin to advance to you. But it really sums up the ideal steps that we found. Of course, every industry person, every aquaculturist is going to take this basic work and modify it and adapt it for their own particular area and location, and they're going to improve upon it. So this is just kind of proof of concept, a starting point, and the industry can take it from there. Okay, this just highlights some of the work we're doing in terms of growing surf clams off the coast of New Jersey in the ocean. This project is also looking at the impacts of potential impacts of ocean acidification and climate change. to understand how multiple stressors might impact the success of aquaculture. And then again, looking towards selective breeding to try and, improve the animal's ability to handle these anticipated stressors that are going to come forward with climate change. So that's a really important project and exciting project. Again, this is done directly with industry participants. So we're really excited about that. And we'll probably get clams planted in the fall, I think, on this project. It's just in its first year. Okay. So, we were growing oysters down in the lower bay in this rack and bag culture, as you see on the left image there. And there's very limited space there for an expansion of the industry. So members of this industry were interested in moving up bay to leases, shellfish growing areas that were abandoned when MSX hit the bay. So there's lots and lots of acreage of shellfish cultivation grounds. No one is really using the traditional fishery, moved away from using those grounds. So can we do cage culture in those areas? Well, these areas might be, 15, 18 feet of water. Delaware Bay has a very broad fetch. It's very, dynamic and can really be a kicker in storms. So you need some pretty robust equipment. So we worked with Atlantic Capes Fisheries to assess some cage designs that they developed and look at the handling and also look at the economics of it. How does it compare to rack and bag culture? Of course, there's quite a bit more investment in terms of capitalization. You need really large vessels, very large cages, as you can see here. And then how do the oysters grow within these cages? What are the optimal densities? Do the oysters that are placed in the center, are they at a disadvantage to the oysters that are on the edge because the water flow might be restricted? How does the product look at the end? What is the shape? So we worked with them, again, very collaborative with industry, helping them assess the innovations that they were making. So we now have they have moved forward with additional vessels and expanding gear and locations, and they've been pretty successful with growing their company in these deeper water sites. And we see additional industry people, fishermen actually transitioning, adding aquaculture to their business portfolios. So that was a pretty exciting project as well. Okay. Looking on the Atlantic coast, this is Dale Parsons. Anyone who frequents Tuckerton probably knows Dale. His family's been in clam growing, clam harvesting business for generations. And Dale is a real innovator in the field, in the industry. There are a lot of areas where hard clams aren't planted because they're too deep to get to and put screens down and keep predators away. The main predator we're concerned about, cownose rays. Their abundances seem to be increasing in our area, partly a distributional shift with climate change, likely not going to go away anytime soon. And they can really destroy a crop, be it oysters or hard clams. So Dale had this idea of trying to work these deeper areas where you just can't really manage screens. By planting clams and then putting layers of shell hash on top of those clams. Would this be a deterrent to the predator, the cownose ray? So we set up with Dale a bunch of experimental plots. Some plots had bare bottom. Some plots had, certain degree of shell coverage on top of clams. And we look to tag cownose rays, watch their behavior, watch their movements around these plots, and see if the hard clams were really protected under the shell hash. This is an ongoing project. Unfortunately, I can't report any results to you at this time. But again, it's just a highlight of the type of work we're doing. This work was led by Dr. Daphne Monroe in a partnership grant with Dale Parsons. So pretty exciting and cool research. And the work with the tagging of the rays is being done by Tom Grotus at the field station there in Tuckerton. So that was, it's great to have him added to the team. Okay. Another important area of research has to do with understanding wildlife interactions. As oyster farming grows in New Jersey and along the East Coast of the United States, we want to understand how does the placement of gear in locations interact with wildlife? Is that a problem? How do we mitigate problems? If it is a problem, can we manage our gear in a way that we're minimizing those issues? One important issue in the lower bay, the Delaware Bay, where there are these intertidal flats, is interaction with horseshoe crabs and the red knot. The red knot is this little bird. If you're not aware of it, it has these tremendous migrations where it starts at the tip of South America and it flies all the way to the Canadian Arctic to breed. During that breeding flight, that journey, it'll stop over along the East Coast of the United States to kind of refuel and fatten up to continue its journey. One of its favorite spots is the lower Delaware Bay. The migration is timed that they land in the bay in May at a time when the horseshoe crabs are spawning and laying their eggs on the beach. And this is like a really preferred food for this bird. So there was concern that as oyster farming grows in this area, is that going to scare away the bird? Is it going to impede horseshoe crabs from getting to the beach to lay their eggs? Will farming activities prevent that bird from foraging in these areas? So we've invested a lot of effort to understand the interactions of horseshoe crabs, birds, and farms. One aspect was to examine how the horseshoe crabs move through oyster farms on their way to the beach. Are they able to adequately move through the farms to get to the beach, or are the farms hindering their ability to pass through? So this was a pretty cool study. You see some posts in that center frame there. They actually have a type of camera that's sonar, and at high tide, we would watch this live video feed from these cameras. You can see the field on the right shows our graduate students analyzing the fields. The video as the footage is coming in, counting the number of horseshoe crabs moving through, documenting distances and such. So we could really look at the crab movement through farms and then at adjacent control sites to see if indeed the behavior and the movement to shore was impacted by the farms. So that was one area that we did some work, and it didn't seem that there was a significant impact of the farms on this movement. So that was a really good thing. Another aspect of this was to look at rack height. You can see, farmers, they typically kept the racks at about 10 inches off bottom. Sometimes the racks sink down into the sand. So there were studies done early on to look at varying rack heights to see how that affects the ability of horseshoe crabs to move through. These are all very practical things, right? There are management perspectives. If the racks are blocking the crab movement, maybe the higher rack would provide a management strategy to minimize that risk. Okay, so another aspect of this work was looking at red knot distribution across farms, adjacent to farms, and also the distribution of horseshoe crab eggs across farms. The interesting thing about all this work is because there are now very strict conservation measures to avoid interaction with the birds at all, a lot of this work needed to be done in the middle of the night when the birds were not foraging. So we had crews going out the entire month of May, walking up and down the beaches, documenting densities of eggs. And then the next day there would be observers on the beach looking at bird distributions and trying to correlate egg densities and bird distributions and looking at how the farms impact the foraging. This work was conducted with Daphne Monroe, Brooke Maslow, and Julie Lockwood at Rutgers University and Conservation field. So again, the goal of this is to understand those interactions, try and minimize those interactions, and advance kind of a movement forward of both conservation practices that protect the birds and continuation of the farming. Okay. Next up, we have a very big project where we're developing a GIS mapping program that would provide a tool for siting farms and give managers and farmers basically a tool where they can look at perhaps the site that they're proposing to grow to place a farm, and layer on different aspects, including physical and biological parameters that are relevant, as well as conflicts. Are there aquatic vegetation that we're trying to avoid? Are there hard clam populations that we're trying to avoid? Are there navigational channels? Are there red knot distributions, sensitive areas? And I think the map that's shown there, the red dots, are showing, locations where red knots have occurred. So this is an ongoing project that involves a lot of different stakeholders. We're trying to talk to recreational fishermen and commercial fishermen and, environmental groups to understand where they see sensitive areas, where there might be conflicts, to look at areas where the biology is such and the water depth is such that farms can flourish. So hopefully this tool will be used by managers and industry moving forward, and perhaps eventually we'll get to the point where there's some broader spatial plan that would kind of consider future growth and kind of look at where that growth maybe is best to occur. Okay, so yesterday, one of our graduate students, Janine Barr, defended her thesis. It was a really exciting day, and her work really focused on the water quality benefits of oyster farms. So probably most of you have, a broad understanding that oysters are keystone species in the estuaries where they grow. They provide a lot of biological, environmental ecosystem services, including filtering the water, clarifying the water, which supports aquatic vegetation growth and keeps the water column healthy, provide physical space and three-dimensional structure for organisms to settle on. That provides refuge and feeding sources for recreational commercial fish and crabs. So Janine and Daphne Monroe and some researchers up in Connecticut at the Milford Laboratory have been looking to evaluate the filtration capacity of oyster farms. How well do they filter the water? What are the biodepositions like? So ultimately, we want to understand, how do farms compare to natural productive oyster reefs? And also, what might be the value of an oyster farm in terms of ecological benefits? Can we eventually put a dollar amount to this? In the Chesapeake Bay, they're already working on piloting nutrient trading programs, which could be used to pay farms for their environmental benefit. So Janine did a great job looking at 3 different farms, 2 in New Jersey, 1 in Delaware, different types of farms and different locations and at different seasons. So she made this contraption which had little compartments for individual oysters. And then she measured the filtration capacity of these individual oysters. And through a series of calculations, we'll be able to actually scale up and look at the benefits of a single farm. And ultimately, there'll be a tool attached to this project where a farmer could go into an online tool, put the number of oysters at the various sizes and their location and come out with this is how much water is filtered. This is how much, nitrogen is removed. So that's a very cool project that we're pretty excited about. Okay, along those same terms, we're looking at environmental benefits of oyster farms in terms of biodiversity on the farms. How does the farm function as a habitat for lots of different critters? And the way we did this study is we deployed GoPro cameras on farms, collected video footage, and then analyzed hours and hours and hours of video footage. You can see a short list there of some of the animals that we found on the sites, how they're using the farms. And, a lot of this work that we're seeing in the literature is actually showing that farms are even more diverse than adjacent bottom. So again, it's pointing the direction of the industry as it grows. It's not only providing economic benefit and food, it's also providing really important ecological services. So it's important that we document these aspects and, hopefully we can understand, how they're supporting habitat restoration and enhancement. Okay, we're getting close now. Hopefully, Caitlin, am I doing all right on time? I think I'm still.
Oh yeah, you're great.
Okay, so it's no surprise probably that as COVID-19 struck, shellfish farms were among the many industries that were very negatively impacted. So a lot of our small farms, the only outlet for their product in their previously existing business models was direct to restaurant sales. So with the closure of restaurants, many of our farms completely lost that revenue stream with a lot of uncertainty as to when it would return. So they had farms full of oysters. Those oysters continued to grow. They didn't stop growing when the market stopped. So we had this problem of oysters actually outgrowing the market size, and also large oysters taking up space in gear that would, normally be cycled to the younger year class. Because we have overlapping year classes, the gear is recycled. So NOAA Sea Grant put out a call for grants to, acknowledge that this was, there were these problems happening with aquaculture and impacts, and, create a project to address these in a rapid short-term response way. So one of the projects we put together was a purchase program, buying oysters from shellfish farms to plant for habitat restoration. So we know there are a lot of efforts around the world to restore natural oyster reef habitat. There's been tremendous declines, and with oysters being such a keystone species, an important ecological service provider, people work to restore oysters. So this was just a way kind of to create a win-win situation where we could buy oysters from the farmers, plant them at target restoration sites, and give the farmers a little bit of money in their pocket to kind of get through that rocky road, to help them get through it. And then also look at the longer term view of creating sort of a shellfish exchange where oyster farmers could come together and in the future kind of have a broker to connect oyster farms with restoration projects. So can we plant these larger oysters, get a jump start with those ecological services, and build this new habitat? And how might we move forward with that to diversify a farmer's business portfolio. Maybe it's, 5% of your sales are all those ugly oysters that you aren't sending to restaurants are going to habitat restoration projects. So this project kind of responded to that need. There's a lot of interest in this still, and we're still working toward developing future program. I think something like 90% of the participants, the shellfish grower participants in this project, are interested in moving forward with additional provision of oysters for habitat restoration, and not just for the monetary value, but also because they see value in improving the water quality, the habitats in the bays where they're growing their oysters, right? If the water quality isn't suitable for oyster shellfish farms, they're not going to be able to grow oysters there. So kind of like a win-win situation. And, we look to continue to develop this work and build a program around it. Okay. Another effort that came out of that same project was because so many farms were pivoting and trying to connect with consumers through non-traditional means, direct to customer, direct to door delivery, online sales and shipping. We created a directory of shellfish growers so that you could easily get the contacts for farms that were selling direct to customers, or where their market was and what means they were selling their product. This is available at the New Jersey Aquaculture Association website, which is njaquaculture.org/find. We'll get you to this brochure. And I have a ton of hard copies too, which hopefully when we start meeting in person again, there'll be a big stack at JC NERR for you to have one for your refrigerator. Okay, I think this might be maybe one of my last initiatives, but we're talking about, right, growing an industry. How do we man that industry? What does our workforce look like? And one of the things we would really like to do at New Jersey Sea Grant and both Rutgers University is begin to introduce aquaculture as a potential career at a young age, at middle school and high school, and look at alternate pathways that you can be involved in a career relating to aquaculture, or perhaps have your own business and be an entrepreneur. So we're working right now. This spring, we'll be launching a program for high school students. So if you know of any candidate students, we'll have 4 weeks, 1 hour a week series online where they'll be kind of get the introduction of aquaculture and aquaculture careers, and then a 1 week hands-on camp. Well, they'll be in classroom and in working with Rutgers in the field and Sea Grant. And then also they'll put in 20 hours of service hours, either at a research institution that's focusing on aquaculture, or perhaps with a commercial farm. So again, we're pretty excited about this. And if it's something that you have a student who's interested in, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be sure that their teachers get the information. Okay, lastly, I'm talking about all these projects, and as I said at the beginning, it's a very large portfolio. There's a tremendous number of individuals involved in this work, and I am really presenting the work of other lead researchers as well as my own. So I just wanted to make sure we recognize some key researchers and students, project partners, including New Jersey Sea Grant and JDP. Stockton was very involved in that last, the restoration project work. In fact, we planted at their restoration site as one of our sites. And of course, we have, all of this work is dependent on grant funds. So we work with a lot of different agencies, National Science Foundation, Sea Grant, NOAA Fisheries, USDA. None of this work would be possible without the support of them. So, we're really appreciative of that support. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was excellent. So many impressive and very relevant research projects you got going on. It's pretty amazing. So thank you so much. We'll give you a virtual round of applause. And if anyone has questions for Lisa, please come off mute, or you can put your question in the chat.
Yeah, sorry for not pausing in there as we had planned.
Oh, no, yeah, that was fine. And also for everyone, I put that aquaculture.org website in, so you can find all the different shellfish growers and farmers across the state too. All right, no questions. Oh, someone said, great presentation, thanks. So Lisa, for that high school program, is there somewhere on your website as well that I can direct teachers in case they're interested, or should they just contact you?
Yeah, not yet. We don't have anything up just yet.
Okay.
We'll have a formal announcement out, so probably they can contact me, or they can contact Diana Burek at New Jersey Sea Grant.
Okay, sounds good.
Oh, no questions. That's not good.
It means you did a amazing job covering everything.
Hopefully everybody still made it through.
I love the idea of adapting during COVID and having the farmers and their helping the farmers and their oysters, using them for a different purpose. That's also just as beneficial. So I think that was a really neat project. And you said that that's still ongoing?
Well, we're trying to keep this idea, develop a formalized broker, essentially, that would serve as that interface, possibly between state restoration projects and other NGOs that have restoration projects, kind of like create a grower collective. So it's just easier to facilitate sort of a transaction of farm raised oysters to the restoration practitioner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then looking for funds, is there a federal program that might match up, such as, NRCS has some special conservation projects. So would that fit into that type of funding? So we're continuing to work on that.
Great. Yeah. Paul, looks like your camera's on. Did you have a question?
No, I enjoyed the program quite a bit. And Tuckern's a place, the seaport, where you might want to show some of this research. We'd be very interested in talking about giving you space that, we have 30,000 visitors a year, that we have it upstairs, of course, for JC NERR. But this stuff I think is fascinating when you begin to see the complications of the interconnections of all the different environmental things, as well as economic impacts. It's not just, nothing's in isolation, and what you're doing is this real broad-based, how is it affecting the other? So the one solution doesn't cause another problem.
Right.
And that's neat. That's neat.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's great is we have this, very progressive industry that's very interested in, innovating and managing in a way that's environmentally responsible. So, it's important that consumers understand that too, right? When we're focusing on local, sustainably grown, environmentally responsibly grown products, that we get the word out there, right? That this is happening in our backyard, and there are multiple benefits. So.
All right. Any final thoughts, questions for Lisa today? And if something comes later on, feel free to reach out and ask your question later on, but give anyone a chance before we sign off.
Well, thanks so much for having me today. I appreciate it, Caitlin.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. What's that?
And everyone that joined.
Yeah, and your internet sounded and looked perfect.
I know.
It all looked great. Well, thank you again for doing a rescheduled talk for us, and thanks everybody for coming to the presentation today. We will hopefully see you at the next Lunch and Learn. Again, that's February 23rd, and hope everybody has a great day. Thank you again, Lisa.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, bye everybody.